Hello, I'm Jamie Johnson. Welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. Today, our guest is Representative Dean Knudson. Dean, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jamie.
Well, we get to see you a little bit less than we did when you were mayor, but we've had you on the show already once as representative of this district here with Hudson and River Falls and the western portion of St. Croix County and Pierce County. So what things have changed? I know there's been a lot going on. The budget bill, which was being debated at the time you were last on, ended up getting bifurcated from the collective bargaining changes, and so that both ended up getting passed, and we've had some changes to our voting laws and a bunch of other things. So why don't you give us a rundown of what you see as maybe your Dave Letterman top 5 list instead of maybe a top 10 list?
Okay. We balanced the budget. We didn't raise taxes. Those were two key things because we had a big $3.6 billion budget deficit. So there was a choice. Either we could increase taxes or we could honestly address the spending and make cuts on the spending side.
Oh, and if I can stop you there, because I applaud balanced budgets. I like that. I like the no raising of the taxes. My question is, when you say balance the budget, because there was talk about the budget bill and then there was the budget repair bill, and I may have misspoke before as to what was pending before the legislature when you were last on, and it's been too many months, but basically they both ended up getting passed, and we're beyond now that fiscal year where the budget repair bill was intended to act. Did we end up that biennium in the black or in the red?
We ended up the biennium after making the changes. We ended up a little bit in the black.
Okay.
Okay. We're required to keep a very small kind of margin there. It's really, as a rainy day fund, it doesn't really even count because it wouldn't help you very much if it was really raining. But we ended up after making those changes. So to go back to that, we had the $3.6 billion budget crisis that we were dealing with was going forward for this, what is now our current biennium, but what was the budget that started July this
2011.
year. 2011 through 13, that budget. And what that means is that if you leave all the taxes and fee structure and everything the same, if you leave all your spending programs the same, so that with projected enrollments and all of those things, that this is how much we'd be short. And we've had a chronic habit in Wisconsin of having what we call structural deficits, which means we've made promises in the future to provide things, to spend, and we haven't had the money to do it. And we've known going forward that there wouldn't be the money there, but we spend the money anyway.
But we've also had a habit of calling them budget cuts when in fact all you're trying to do is put a freeze on spending. We've had this inertia of the budget spending just growing. And as soon as somebody wants to put a stop to that, then they're cutting things. So.
Well, and it is a cut, but it's a definition of terms. I mean, the old baseline budgeting thing where if you were hoping for a 5% increase and you only got a 4% increase, then was that a cut or not? Some say that's an increase.
Right.
It was 4% increase. But back to your first premise, so the budget repair bill was introduced and there were two parts to it. One was to go back to the previous biennial budget and make some cuts in order to balance it. And that's something that isn't uncommon, and that needed to be done. The second part of that was the collective bargaining changes in what now became known as Act 10 once it was signed into law. The budget repair part of it was ultimately done, and that wouldn't have been controversial, not very much. The collective bargaining part, that's been really critical. That's what's led to most of the political uproar and upheaval that we've had in Wisconsin, but it's really been an important reform. It's one of the most fundamental reforms of government and the way it operates that we've seen in the United States.
And we saw how that unfolded in the damage to the Capitol with the protests and so forth, and We had legislators fearing for their safety and so forth. Do you think, in hindsight now, and I don't want to do a lot of revisionism here, but just in that one act of trying to get it all passed as one instead of separating it out from the very beginning, if there had been an Act 1 separated from an Act 10, do you think that that would have maybe helped with some of that rancor?
I don't think that it would have made very much difference. If it had been proposed just as those changes to collective bargaining, you'd still have seen the same, there are constituencies there that would have been extremely upset. These are painful changes. And from the very beginning, everyone recognized that it's painful. There's nothing that was really radical about the idea that employees should pay in a portion of their health insurance. And that's common. In the private sector, 25 or 30% is common. The average in Wisconsin was under 5% for our public employees. Now it's 12%. So we're still not to where most private sector employees are. The part about paying into the pension, there was nothing radical about that. The thing people have to remember is that we have a sound Wisconsin retirement system, our statewide pension system that almost all public employees are in. It's a good system. And it is that old defined benefit kind of a plan where you get a guaranteed for life payment. If you've worked long enough, worked a full career, it's pretty generous payment. Still get that. Used to get it without paying into it. Now that cost of the payments going in is shared. In the sharing, it's 50-50. So that's about like if somebody had a 401k, right now maybe they get a partial match. We have essentially a 1-to-1 match now. So if the employee pays in whatever, the employer pays the other half of that. What you're going to see though, Jamie, as we go forward is some of the other changes in Act 10 are as important, maybe more important for cost savings. The ability to bid out the health insurance, we've seen school districts, for example, around the state saving hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases over $1 million a year.
Didn't Hudson? Wasn't
Hudson was one of them.
Yeah.
Over $1 million a year. And that was without really changing the structure of the health plan. The other part of it, and you might remember we talked about this, I think, when I served as mayor of the city of Hudson, we implemented a high deductible plan coupled with an individual account that was called an HRA account, similar to an HSA. Employees loved it. It gave them empowerment over the dollars and the choices, and it lowered the cost dramatically. We saved $400,000 a year doing that.
As a small city.
As a small city, much smaller than the school district. That's a change that it was extremely difficult to get to. I did it, and we bargained our way to it with 3 different unions. But it's been extremely difficult or almost impossible to get there. You will start to see those kinds of plans come because now the school boards have freedom and flexibility to make changes. Other areas that we'll see will be changes in, for example, teacher pay. To pay excellent, the very best teachers may start to get paid accordingly. So
more go towards merit rather than just...
We've had no merit pay in Wisconsin, really. I mean, for all practical purposes, there's been very little.
Other than the presumption you're a better teacher if you've been doing it for 25 years.
Yet to be passed, but there is some legislation working through the legislature now. SB 2, I believe, is a bill that for the first time would allow student scores to be used as a part of evaluating a teacher. That's been against the law in Wisconsin. We've got a lot of different areas where school boards will be able to be creative and try to figure out what works best for them. And so I think particularly in education, there were more cost savings coming. Give you an example. Governor announced the proposed compensation plan for state employees this past week. Changes to the way sick pay is done. Changes to the overtime rules. Overtime rules have been really abused, particularly in the corrections department. I talked about this when I was a candidate. It was, I think, 3 years ago. There were over 4 dozen corrections officers that made over $100,000 a year. Some of them made over $100,000 just in their overtime. And there are dozens that made over $140,000 a year that year. What happens in that defined pension plan is if you work 30 years, you're going to get something on the order of 60% of your pay. And it's based on your highest 3 years. So if you can game the system, you end up getting a pension that's based on those highest years' pay. By ending that practice, it's going to save $300,000 a year. On a 10-year period, that's another $3 billion. So, yeah, I think
300,000 or
$300 million a year.
300 million a year.
$300 million a year. Okay. Between changing the sick pay policies and
calculation of pensions
and the overtime.
Overtime, right.
Overtime.
So keeping those annual salaries and annual income down so that when you do them, when you look back over the career, then those 3 years are not as high.
Well, it wasn't your 3 final years, it was your 3 highest years, so if you could, and what would happen was that...
so was that changed? It's now 3
changed.
Final years?
No, it's 3 highest still. I personally think that the overtime shouldn't count. I mean, teacher doesn't get overtime, so in essence what happens is some people get
so you're
more
treating
out of
some
that.
unions better than others and certain workers better.
Not as fair.
Well, we were going to get to that, and the little bit of prep that we have for this talk, we want to talk about maybe what's going on forward, and I think that's a great recap. Again, I know that the governor's intent in making these changes was to, one, try to balance the budget without raising taxes, but also create jobs too. And there is a perception that benefits were taken away from certain state workers, not all state workers, but certain state workers, and then that's going to be given now to businesses in the form of tax credits and other benefits to businesses. Is there any truth to that, or is it depending on your perspective?
It's not depending on your perspective, but that was a spin, or I would say a kind of a distorted way of explaining what went on. I mean, we had a budget repair bill to correct a deficiency in what was going on in the last 2-year budget. At the same time, we came in and we made some changes, some tax credit. We changed business taxes. That didn't go into effect until this next 2-year budget, and it won't affect tax revenues until it's been in place for a while and the business, files their first tax return and so on. So the two happened at the same time. They're separate. I mean, they weren't related. They were similar amounts. The focus is to improve our economy. The way we intend to do it is to improve the business climate, to make Wisconsin more attractive so that we have businesses that want to grow and expand, that want to move here.
Okay, now I want to talk about that because we try to stick to our half hour, but we always inevitably get closer to 45, and I have a feeling we could talk for an hour and a half just because it's been a while. We need to get you on here more frequently. But when it comes to the jobs, I know that there's been a special session called by the governor, and if you look at the signs at every border, and we have one here in Hudson that says open for business, what of those 20 or so bills that were set before the legislature to take up in this special session, what show the most promise for job creation?
Well, before I forget, I should tell you that the jobs numbers that just came out, and we've got a really tough economy nationally and in Wisconsin. Families are hurting. Businesses have oftentimes been sort of hanging on flat, no growth or down, and there aren't as many jobs as we'd like there to be. Our national unemployment hangs at around 9%. State unemployment now is ticked down a little last month, but we're still real close to 8%, just under. But St. Croix County and Pierce County moved to the lowest unemployment in the state in the numbers that were just reported for last month, at 4.9%. Our local economy is stronger than most of the rest of the state, even the Madison area where they've got the thriving biotech and they've got the research companies around there.
And a lot of public sector jobs.
Public sector jobs that have tended to be stable and have still been stable through all the trouble. I mean, the one thing is people have less take-home pay with the new plan. So the public employees have less take-home pay, no doubt about it. But almost without exception, they still have their job. And we're unlike almost any other state in that regard, because most states, even states like New York and Illinois, they're laying off and cutting public employees. So back to the 20 bills, and the governor called a special session again. There's tax credit bills in there, a number of tax credit bills to try to incentivize businesses to grow and to make it more attractive for them to hire employees. So there's a number of those. There are streamlining regulation bills. So, for example, permitting process if you need to build and you're near a wetland, that'll be, still the environmental protections are still there, but the process is streamlined. You had asked before about tort reform, and being an attorney, I know that you know more about the whole court system than I do, so I'm not an expert in that.
Okay.
Ask me a animal health question, though. No,
there you go.
because I'm a veterinarian and I'm not an attorney. But there is tort reform. We did do tort reform in January. It was one of our very first bills that we took up, was changing who gets to be an expert witness in Wisconsin. And we adopted the federal standard for determining that, and some other things that I think, opinions vary on almost everything that we do.
Well, there's always going to be resistance to change anytime you have change, but that probably in the long run will be an improvement. What you're trying to do is prevent the junk science experts from getting on the stand with very little credentials on experimental or novel ideas and saying that they're an expert in this field.
Right.
I guess focusing on those, and I understand about the angel investment tax credits and doing some things about being able to front load the refunds so that they can make that part of their financing packages, and that will help business. I guess I do want to look at a couple of the ones that lawyers have been made aware of, both defense and plaintiff lawyers, because I get the emails from lobbyists for both on how they phrase these things, and there was just a couple that I want to talk about. First, no particular order here, but we've got the interest rate on judgments. And your average person probably doesn't know what that interest rate is, but Wisconsin has had a relatively high rate. It's 12% on a judgment. So you sue somebody and it gets reduced to a judgment. That judgment from the day that it's entered gets 12% interest. And in Minnesota, it's been historically around 5%, and other states 4 to 6% is the norm. Now, one of the provisions of these bills is to reduce that so that it floats with the prime. So when the prime rate goes up, and we've had in history, we've had the prime rate, get up around 10%, then it would be back in that range of 11, 12% for an interest rate on the judgment. Currently, it would be 4.25. But the curious thing about the bill is that it doesn't treat all judgments alike. It depends whether or not you're a debtor, whether you're a business or an individual when the judgment's against you. If you're a business, you get to enjoy the only 4.25%, but if you're an individual, then it's 12%. Now, I don't understand how making that difference would help create jobs.
Well, let's go back to the original intent, or what I understand the intent of that one to be. It's just to bring the interest rate to a fair market rate. And so, like other states that you mentioned, our rate has been high. So I think that, to me, seems common sense that we would bring that down. A floating rate or a variable rate that floats with what interest rates are doing.
It gets reset at the first of the year or something like that.
Gets reset periodically, and it'd be hard for either side to say it's not a fair rate. I'm not in favor of playing favorites amongst different parties, whether it's in the legal system or if it's out in the business world. I mean, too often we end up subsidizing a business that's sort of the political flavor of the day. And too often you've got, sometimes it's, you could say, political cronyism. And they're the favorite. And so they want the legislature to rewrite the rules so that they become a winner. I tend to resist that.
Right.
And on this one, I'd just soon see that interest rate be applied variable like that for everyone. I don't see why it should be a fixed rate for any of the parties.
Right. Well, I appreciate that too. That's kind of where I would come from if I were in your shoes. But another part to this is that you don't want to make the rate so low that there's not an incentive to pay it, because that's a big problem, especially in a slow economy where people figure, hey, the judgment is only 4%. That loan that the guy sued me on originally was a 15% loan, let's say. Yeah. It gets reduced to a judgment, and it was originally $100,000. So after a year of not paying on that contract, it should be a $115,000 judgment. But as soon as you reduce it to judgment, to have it reduced to 4% is a huge benefit. And I think there's probably a happy medium there. But
I have a lot of faith in our, particularly in our circuit court judges around the state. Maybe a little less faith in the Dane County judges sometimes, but I mean, I think the judges can work that out. I mean, if you aren't paying on it, ultimately, then there's some other legal cause of action, I suppose, that could happen. So.
I think what you want to do is not remove the incentive of paying the judgments. In Wisconsin, at 12%, it's clear that judgments get paid much faster if it's a debtor that wants to either stay in business or stay solvent anyway, and not declare bankruptcy. Yeah. The other one was medical devices and drugs. If they get approved by the FDA, the proposal is to make it so that a consumer that was injured by a drug or a medical device that was approved by the FDA, they would not be able to sue the manufacturer of that product. I know that the intent was to protect people, or protect companies that do business here in Wisconsin, and that get them to relocate, especially in the biotech area. I mean, Minnesota already has
we'd love to see this area expand in Wisconsin, and we look, you know, we have insurance. In Wisconsin, we have a lot of insurance companies. But here in the St. Croix Valley, we live so close to Minnesota that it's hard not to be aware of all their medical device companies, particularly in the Twin Cities. And those are really good jobs, good companies. We'd like them to come here. But I fear that this is one of those where it's sort of flavor of the day. And I don't like the idea that we'd have one set of rules for a particular company or someone who's making a certain product, and that would be playing favorites to another. So again, that's another bill that I haven't had a chance to vote on that one yet. But
well, what this legislation would primarily do is prohibit, it says injured Wisconsinites from suing, but injured residents in 48 other states. There's one other state that does provide that kind of immunity, but it would be Wisconsin and that other state, and I can't tell you what it is right now, but they would not be able to sue, but the ones in the other 48 would still be able to sue that manufacturer, even if they were located here in Wisconsin. So that's a work in progress, I guess. The final one that, as it relates to our courts and tort reform somewhat, but primarily access to litigation, is a limit on attorney's fees. And we have certain types of litigation. Well, let's back up. Wisconsin does not follow the European. The European rule is loser pays, and we don't.
Will you vote for that?
If we had that in this country, I'd say we'd see many fewer frivolous lawsuits.
You know, I think the state of Texas just recently took a little bit of a move in that direction, and there's been some talk in the Capitol about that. I like that idea.
But we don't have it now. We have the American rule.
We do.
And in essence...
And you know who wins when you go to court and litigate? The attorneys tend to win.
Well,
that's the view of the public, and and I think what we're trying to get away from here. I mean, the example that that I read in regard to this, cap where it's a multiple of whatever the compensatory damages are.
Three times, right?
Was a case where, it was a car owner and a car dealer, and they end up in a dispute, and the dispute's over something that might be, I think it was $5,000 or $10,000 deal, but they couldn't get together on it. Before it was all done, one of them won, but there was $150,000 in attorney fees. Well, at some point along the way, there ought to be a system where they're incentivized to say, look, let's just get together and settle this thing, because the only one that's getting rich is the lawyers, and in the end, they're going to get paid one way or another, right? Plus interest at 12%.
In theory, they are. I mean, that's the conventional wisdom that it happens. In reality, it doesn't happen that way, but I see too many times where the legislature has to protect us from ourselves.
Yeah.
Type of thing. And we should be able to have judges. When it says that reasonable attorney fees can be awarded, you need to have judges that have the guts to say, this is excessive, this is not reasonable. Instead of this $300,000 fee you're submitting, I'm only going to award you $10,000 because you didn't need to litigate it like this. Especially when you can point to an early offer of settlement. And there's been already movement in our industry in that regard. I've seen mediation and ADR, alternative dispute resolution, has resolved lawsuits.
Yep.
But
I'm not an expert on this particular subject
Right.
area. I know this bill, I believe, went through the state Senate after I left Madison this week, or on the day that I was leaving. There was an amendment that was offered, change that.
Okay.
That language. I'm not certain exactly where that stands. I imagine that'll be coming.
I'll do
over
more
to us.
research and then I'll send you an email on
Yeah.
it. But in the end, I think that some type of cap that is a presumption. That is, that unless you can prove there was really good reason to exceed it. And the situations you see many times are where I think it was enacted in the first place, is inequitable positions. I think it's taken to an excess like in the landlord-tenant situations. Many times a tenant doesn't get back $100 of their security deposit, and then they sue saying that you should have returned this to me. And there's laws that allow attorney's fees in the instance where it's not properly returned by the landlord. Not all landlords are rich, and so that's where it's been used against some people in situations where, again, if we had a cap and a reasonable presumption, probably would make some sense. But there's...
Well,
go ahead.
Not to change subject
Yeah.
off of
I was ready for a
off
segue.
of tort
so go
reform,
ahead.
but let's segue, because here's a couple other things going on. We got redistricting, there's the voter ID law, there's concealed carry. You take your pick. Getting the economy turned around and trying to grow jobs is where most of the focus is. But
Those three things you just mentioned don't have any much direct effect on jobs.
no, they don't. But we are still representatives of 5.5 million people that are living their lives, and there's a set of laws. They want the laws to be changed. The economy can be good and it can be bad, and we've focused on the economy, but not to the exclusion of other things. And so we've been debating on a lot,
Okay.
particularly education reform and changes there. We could talk about all those things
Sure,
too.
and we have a few minutes. Let's just touch on those, because conceal and carry. Do you think in the end it's going to be much ado about nothing, similar to the outrage that was initially in Minnesota, and after they had their law in effect, it pretty much died down? And
I absolutely do. This is a fundamental right protected by the Constitution. We were one of only 2 states that didn't allow it. Now there will only be Illinois left after we passed this law, and it goes into effect on November 1st, so you can start to apply, and there will be a period for your background check and so on. And probably by mid-December, people will start having permits, so it's not going to be until into the next year, but I don't expect that you're going to see much change. I mean, life goes on. Tell you the truth, I didn't go through a metal detector here, and you didn't either, so I have no way of knowing if you're carrying right now, and that's been the way it's been for 20 years. I don't really care if you are or not.
But the way that the law was written is in such a way that places like the YMCA and churches
Sure.
have to post a sign that guns aren't.
They don't have to, but they can if they decide that's what's right for them.
Yeah, right.
If that happens, the only people that go in there with a gun are guaranteed going to be a criminal, and they'll also know that there's no one else in there who's armed. If they don't post, then there might be some good guys in there that happen to be armed. And so that's the decision for them to make. And I think that as time goes on, and you've probably seen, because you mentioned the Minnesota analogy, you remember how many signs there were? There are lots and lots of places over in Minnesota now that no longer have their signs up. It wasn't an issue. They found that for people that cared, ultimately, they didn't care. They've had concealed carry in Minnesota. When you go shopping over there, do you feel any less safe? Do you check at the door of every store you go into to see whether it's posted? Probably not, because I'm wagering you don't really care. You don't feel less safe because you know in the back of your mind that, hey, that guy across the aisle from me might have a concealed carry permit and be legally carrying a weapon. Difference does it make?
Yeah, we can revisit this one in 2 years and see if it's even an issue of public discussion. One that may or may not is the redistricting.
Yes.
And I have to say, I know that every 10 years we get a new plan based on the census, and it just so happens whichever party's in power ends up being able to draw the lines. Normally, though, there's a court that ends up reviewing it. Did that happen in this case, or is it going to happen?
Well, not normally. I mean, it's a legislative process by our Constitution. It's given to the legislature. It's designed to be a political process, and it's always been a political process. When you say normally, what my choice of words would have been is to say oftentimes we've had split,
more often than not.
We've had split control, and so we haven't had one party in control in Madison, which we have right now. And because of that, it won't be turned over to the judges. But judges aren't perfect either. I mean, they drew lines and they created districts that people aren't happy with.
Okay.
It always creates a little bit of unhappiness. I had people call me complaining that their city used to have 2 representatives, and now, because they're all in one district, they only have 1, and they're unhappy about that, less representation. And I also had constituents call and say, you know what, where I live, we used to have 1 and now we have 2, and I'm unhappy about that. It's change. Change is always...
It changes. I'm a stepping back from that and from the political things, but just why does it have to be the way that it looks now, particularly with Ron Kine's district and what was done with that? Why couldn't you just take and do some redistricting, like a first grader or a kindergarten could just draw boxes and divide the state up into 8 sections, and boom, you're done?
Okay, so Jamie, there's 2 different standards at play for when we draw our state lines for all the legislative districts and the federal. It's all controlled by some federal rulings and litigation that's gone on in the past. So the principles are largely the same, but it's a little bit different for them. And the past practice has been that our current incumbent congressmen get together and draw a map, and it's forwarded to the legislature, and we look at it and vote on it. Frankly, I was pretty happy to have St. Croix County in the 3rd Congressional District. We ended up being a little bit of a trading piece on a board, is the way it feels for us here in St. Croix County.
Well, isn't it, I mean, putting all the cards on the table, basically St. Croix County, for it, which is generally pro-Republican, is going to be shifted up to the 7th, and the 3rd now gets Stevens Point area, which has been traditionally a Democratic area. Is that what basically the primary change? And you end up with a district of Ron Kine's that zigzags and cuts out central Wisconsin and cuts out areas that he had previously read?
I think it's a reasonable district when you look nationwide and you look at the
Well, there's
history
worse
of
examples in other states.
definitely. I mean,
Yeah.
it is a reasonable district. It's a difficult district to begin with because normally we look at things like communities of interest, try to keep them together. So for example, here in the 30th Assembly District that I represent, Hudson and River Falls stay together. But because it had grown so much, and there's supposed to be 55,000, and the district I represent now was at 65,000. So I needed to, it's going to be 10,000 people smaller.
Right.
But we look at communities of interest, trying to maintain compactness. That's the criteria that you could argue that the new 3rd Congressional District isn't very compact. But these are sprawling, huge districts. The 7th is a sprawling, huge district.
Right.
And so it's, how are you ever going to define what's compact or not? I mean, you have to get in the car and drive a long way to get from one end to the other, no matter how
Right.
you draw that district. There just isn't the population density. I think that one's reasonable. The political controversy in Wisconsin has probably been more about the state legislative lines. And again, I think it'll all hold up in court. I mean, I think it's pretty fair.
Where are we talking about? Because there's no controversy up here in western Wisconsin.
Really not very much. In the Eau Claire area, for example, there's quite a bit of change. So whereas the way it was done the last time by the judges, they created districts that each had a little corner of the city of Eau Claire. So everyone had an outlying district, and they each had a little corner. So they could all say, well, I've got mostly rural, but I represent a little of the city of Eau Claire. The new district makes urban legislators and rural legislators. And you can say that's the right way or the wrong way, but and it often does fall down in party lines.
Right.
So there's actually going to be an open seat urban district there, free
Well, it
for
worked the
taking.
other way too when Democrats were in charge. But doesn't generally what happen is if you got one party in power, what they do is they draw the districts so that they have maybe a 60%, but they don't want a 90% overwhelming, and give those 90% districts to the Democrats. Just give up so many seats and say you're going to win 90% of the time. Like Milwaukee, just take Milwaukee. There's not going to be a Republican in any of those. But then as soon as you start getting on the outside, it's shifted more so that Republicans have a majority that they could sustain.
That's not the way.
And vice versa, in years when Democrats are in control, they kind of do
Whether
the
the judges draw it or not, everyone's aware that it has to pass legal muster. And you don't want to go to all the work of it and then ultimately have judges redo it.
Right.
And that would be a waste of everyone's time. So I mean, that's always the controlling factor. I think it's a good map. A controversy that's going to come up right now, frankly, is what happens with the recalls. And that's just a mess. And it's partly, I voted for that law. I didn't write it, but I voted for it. And we didn't foresee the problems that we created. We set a date in the summer, I think it was August, and said, everything after that point, you're going to use the new map. Before that, you'll use the old map. GAB, the accountability board, the elections board now has said, well, technically I already represent my new district, technically, which is interesting, because I didn't used to have, for example, Roberts, and now so technically, even though I wasn't elected by them, I technically started representing them. But for the recalls, you could have the situation where there are petition drives that start in the spring, get the signatures, as you've seen happen.
You're talking about recalls for 2011?
For the state senators, primarily state senators, but could be for me too. Where you've got right now, you've got to get the signatures in the old district. You file them. If there's any kind of litigation that slows things down, you could have a recall going on in August. Meanwhile, it's already election year next year, so the primary starts in September. There's a primary in September, and the fall November 12 election. That's happening in the new district. You could have two different races going on in two different, with the same people, total mass confusion. GAB sees it. Frankly, they've kind of been one way or another. They don't know how to solve it. We may be going back and amending the redistricting law to clarify that right now. I think something was introduced today that said, hey,
sounds like
it's got to be a date certain so that everybody's on the same page with the same maps.
Okay, so we talked about voting maps. Staying on the subject of voting then, what about, why was the presidential primary changed from February, which it used to be in April, and now it's back to April again? Because we have our, of course, for our nonpartisan offices, the primaries in February and the generals in April. Mm-hmm. And you know, I remember historically it was in April. It got switched with an effort to make Wisconsin more relevant.
That's part of it.
In the national primary. So what's the motivation for changing it back to April? Wisconsin legislators want us to be less relevant on the national scene, or what's
I don't think so.
What was the thinking behind that?
We don't want to have extra elections. We're never going to become Ohio or New Hampshire, Iowa or New Hampshire. We won't, that won't happen. And as you can see, other states that have tried to do that, it becomes a big horse race and it doesn't happen. On the other hand, we could be a decision maker. You take back last time, so it was Republicans were in a race, and ultimately McCain was essentially had won it before we even got to the Wisconsin race.
Right.
But it might not always be that way. I mean, the full spotlight could come on you because you may be a decider. So you can either be real early, where it's sort of the beauty contest of who's going to get off to a good start. You can be lost in with everybody else. You could have a Super Tuesday mass national primary day, which people have talked about that. I think what makes the most sense to me is, you know, just do it on the regular spring election day.
Okay. The final thing, talking about elections, because this is you know, I see arguments on both sides, and that is the voter ID. Just the simple idea of having a picture ID, I don't have any problem with that. Mm-hmm. But what the law that was passed did a lot of other things besides that, and a couple of them had impacts even on our own family. And you're a father of a college student,
sure.
And I've got one now and soon to be two again. We're making it tougher for these kids to vote, and I'm just wondering why that is, and particularly like the residency requirement is going to impact on this next presidential year. When it was a requirement of 10 days, most kids that were going to colleges, whether private or public, were going to be able to fulfill that 10-day requirement. But now you require 28 days, and you're going to basically make it so that only kids who go to college in the towns near where they live are going to be able to vote, basically, or they're going to have to take out absentee ballots.
Well, and which maybe is the best thing for them to do in that situation, honestly. But I mean, to give you, I'm not sure I agree with you that we made it so that they can only vote if they live near there.
Well, I mean, they're not eligible. For instance, my son starts college around September 1st, so does yours. I mean, the university system is universally right around September 1st. If they want to vote in the primary in September, they're going to have to go back home and vote. They cannot vote, in your case, your son, Madison, my son in Menominee, they're not going to be able to vote there.
So that's part of the source of our difference on that. The primary won't be in September anymore. I mean, by federal law, there was a federal, I think it's called the MOVE Act, M-O-V-E, and we have not been in compliance with that law. We need to be. In order to do so, we had to move our primary. Our primary is going to be up in August now. Okay. So in order to be eligible, he'd have to move there in July. If he really wants to move somewhere where he doesn't know anyone, he doesn't know any of the local issues, he doesn't know any of the local candidates, he wants to move there after the campaign is mostly done and then vote, I mean, he can do that. But the reason the Supreme Court years ago said it's perfectly legitimate to have a 30-day residency rule is so that we have informed electorate, so that we have people that are actually going to the polls and voting. We saw this back during the Supreme Court race, where, you know, we had people that registered. We had such a joke of a law in Wisconsin that if you lived here for 10 days, you could register here. And that happened. And in Madison, they were perplexed by the fact that people went and voted then in that election, and they only voted for the Supreme Court race, and they had all these ballots were down the ticket. They didn't vote at all. And I think what's come out, and there were 3 cases shown this week where there were people that were in town protesting or through the whole turmoil of the spring and had registered from their hotel rooms. I mean, we had people that lived in the Capitol for longer than 10 days with their sleeping bags. And they weren't all from Wisconsin, I can tell you that. So, I mean, by our old law, they could have, all they have to do is sign that says, this is now my residence. It's a simple law. I don't think it'll be controversial once we get into it. For college students, I would have made it tougher. I mean, I honestly think if you don't live in this state, you ought to vote absentee in the state you live in. We have had and we will continue to allow Minnesota students to come over and vote here in Wisconsin. That's fine. But what you have to realize is there is absolutely no mechanism in place to follow up or check to see whether they still voted at home. And remember, they still have their Minnesota driver's license. We'll accept that.
When you say at home, you're talking about the example of Minnesota.
Yeah.
Okay, but not in Wisconsin, because there is already that mechanism in place. That because I know from having voted in the election
statewide
this
voter
summer,
registration system now that
Right.
that should catch that and kick you out. In your former place that you voted, they'll get a note to take you off that list, so to make it harder for you to vote 2 places. But we have nothing in place to make it harder for you to vote in 2 states. And if you think that doesn't happen or hasn't been happening, I almost guarantee you it's been happening more than you think. Give you an example, way back in the 2000 election, Gore v. Bush. You look that one up and see how many New Yorkers they found that had voted in both New York and Florida. And a lot of times they say they didn't know there was any law against it. I'm paying taxes in both places. Why shouldn't I be able to vote? Or I live in both places.
yeah,
I want to be able to
claim
vote.
ignorance. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's a good law. It's not designed to suppress the vote. We don't want to disenfranchise anyone. We want to have fair elections where people can come and vote, and that we're not going to have people voting that shouldn't be voting. And the people that say there hasn't been any voter fraud, I've been a poll watcher. I've watched people. You know, the reason you can't prove or prosecute voter fraud is there was no evidence. No DA would ever be able to do anything about it, because you'd have to practically stop the person right there. Voting takes a few minutes, and once it's over, the voter is gone, and there's no way to track that down.
Well, you wouldn't be able to tell who they voted for, but you certainly can tell whether they voted because their name's crossed off a list. For instance,
If I walked in, because we're, well, your hair is darker than mine, we're the same build. If I walked in and said Jamie Johnson and gave your address and voted, when you arrived there, do you know that you would not be allowed to vote? No matter, you could show all the ID you wanted to, you would not be allowed to vote. That has happened every time around the state. There will be those incidents where they, through error or through fraud or whatever. I mean, it's just, it makes no sense to have that. It's purely common sense to ask for ID.
And that's why, yeah, and I said at the beginning of the discussion is that having an ID and showing, who you are is, to me, paramount. I liked being able to have the voter registration card. I've had it in my wallet since I came to Hudson. I pulled it out the last time and they said that's no good anymore. And so that kind of, but it wasn't a big deal for me to pull out a license. Now, some people that don't have one, might be tougher for them.
And like I say, I mean, this law could have been, for as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I think we could have gone farther with it. I think it's very reasonable the way it is. I think it would have been good to have you have current ID. We didn't require that. You could have moved from another state or another city in Wisconsin or another school district, for example. You show your driver's license from that other school district, come and you can still show that, but you have to have registered in where you're voting.
Right, but okay, you may not be able to show that you got your license in the last year. May be able to have a 10-year-old license in order to, or I guess in Wisconsin it'd be 7-year-old license because they have 8-year increments.
But you're supposed to get a new driver's license when you move. That's the piece that people don't tend to do.
But when you say current, if on these UWIDs,
yeah,
for my son, the school says we're only going to issue you one, all right, but the law got written in such a way so that way if you're an upperclassman, a junior or senior, you can't use your student ID to vote.
Sure. We looked at this for a long time and talked about a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, the basic criteria was set to say, look, it needs to have your photo, it needs to have a date that it was issued so that you can tell that it's current. And the date, needs to be valid. So for student IDs, what they came up with is, what used to happen and what happens right now is you get a student ID, and you could still be carrying that and whip it out 8 years later, and it has no date on it. So no one can tell whether you're still a student or not. That won't work with this system because it doesn't have an address. So it needs, if it's going to be a student ID, it's going to have that, and I think as far as redoing them, the universities didn't have the equipment to make them. It won't be that hard for them to do it. There's been some talk about whether they can put a sticker on there or something to make it work. I don't know, but I don't think it's going to be insurmountable for them to do it. And if you lose them, I mean, you have a college kid, I have a college kid, do you think those ever get lost? I mean, they do have a means of making a new one, and they have the means of adding in the data that needs to be there. How many kids do you think there are at most college campuses that don't already have a driver's license?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, one thing I was curious, what is the cost? Because the Legislative Reference Bureau does the LRB does the analysis, and then there's another accounting service, isn't there, that says this is going to be the financial impact of a law. And the governor wants to have all new regulations have to go through a rigorous financial impact study before they're enacted. What's the financial impact of this voter registration law? And was that required to come up with a final figure before that was voted on?
The path that this law has taken is interesting because there was a Wisconsin bill that did not become law several years ago, maybe 6 or 8 years ago. And a legislator in Indiana took that Wisconsin law, brought it to Indiana, and it became Indiana law. Then it was litigated all the way and was upheld. And circle all the way around Wisconsin, when we started, we basically said, well, let's model off that Indiana law. It's one of the most current. They're a pretty similar state in some ways, but not always. Yeah. And so it'll probably stand up to challenge. But here was a key difference. They have driver's license bureaus in every single county, and we didn't. Through budget cuts, we've gradually closed. You probably know that there used to be one down at River Falls, and there isn't, and so on. We're fortunate right here in Hudson and in St. Croix County. I mean, we've got one with good hours, but for some areas, they didn't have that. So that's part of the expense is in order to try to preempt a court challenge based on it was too far to go, we opened up some DMV offices, some driver's license offices again. That's not entirely only to serve this feature. I mean, now it's also a convenience for you if you just moved here and you need to get a driver's license, right? Irregardless of voting. So there's that, but there's some cost to that. And if you don't have a driver's license and you can't afford to get the state ID, you can get that for free, right? By just saying that I want to get it without charge, and normally there's a charge of, it's 30, I don't recall what it is, $30 or $40, I think.
But, so there are some costs associated with it, but nobody knows what the cost is.
Well, it's hard to quantify that. Mm-hmm. At the voting booth, we have some cases volunteers, some cases paid hourly, kind of paid volunteers that run your local election. We've all gone in and we see that there's the clerk, and the clerk has a team there that have been trained, and they're citizens that came to run the election. Do you need more people now because there's an extra step? Some cases, yes. Some cases, probably not. It depends on how the flow of that goes for them. So there could be some local costs. When the Fiscal Bureau does the analysis, they just look at what is the state impact. And the state impact was around opening up those additional driver's license offices.
But didn't include the state impact at all our UWs, which might need to do, because none of the UWs have the 2-year, meet the 2-year, maybe not none. There might have been 1 or 2 campuses that do have the
challenge,
IDs expiring.
To go back to that one more time, the challenge there is it's optional for them to do it. If they choose to do it, they can. In many cases, they've magnetized that, and it's become a swipe card. It may let them into the dorm. They may swipe it at the food service or the cafeteria, and there's money on there, so it's a little bit like a debit card. Because that thing is more than an ID card, it's almost like a combination ID card and credit card. There's some reluctance for them to, for example, put the address on there. Put the picture, the address, I've got a financial component to it, and I've got access to possibly a dormitory. So trying to make that thing become all things,
right,
including your voter ID, became a little difficult. And so that's going to be up to the universities to decide. Some of them may decide that they're not going to try to make that be an ID. Some of them will. I mean, I suspect a lot of them will. Having the date on there, I mean, really, it's kind of a question, why didn't it ever have a date, as far as I'm concerned? Yeah. I mean, should you be able to come 8 years later after you've no longer been enrolled for a long time and show your ID and masquerade as a college student? Because that's what we've had.
Sure, sure. Well, we'll see. I guess next fall, we'll see if the numbers are way down as far as,
for voting. Next fall, I'll make you a prediction. The numbers probably won't be way down because we have intense political interest right now.
Right.
And we're torn between, we've got it's a presidential year, and in Wisconsin, people are pretty interested in what's going on with politics. A little tired of it. Some of them are pretty tired of the recalls and kind of the ceaseless nature.
And maybe we'll, instead of, we're going to see a big influx or increase in absentee ballots. We did with the recalls, and probably will continue into the next year. But as we evolve with technology, I think maybe Oregon and Washington have already been experimenting with the online voting and so forth. And I know, again, trying to prevent against fraud is a big issue, but it's a hard balance between keeping the polls accessible and at the same time avoiding
There's nothing more
fraud.
important, though, than having faith so people have a trust that it's fair. They don't second guess. So when we talk about going to technology, and that better be really rock solid. We don't want to have people that are suspicious that somebody can somehow change the outcome. We've got elections that...
We want to have confidence in our outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
And there may be some in history that will never have confidence.
Well, the conspiracy theories go, and I mean, I think as we go forward with this, the voter ID law should do nothing but increase voters' confidence.
Right.
End of story.
All right. Well, with that, we'll conclude our segment. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for being on the show. I want to thank our viewers as well, and hopefully we'll have you on more frequently, maybe twice a year.
Your new set.
Yes.
You got a little Charlie Rose going here.
Exactly, and we can bring papers and refer to things. So,
nice.
With that, we'll conclude this month's segment and see you next month on Western Wisconsin Journal.